we're diving into some new stuff, and this has come up a couple of times, but I like to just kind of give you the big picture, because I think I just like to think about the big picture. So we're talking about something called biochemistry. And the other day I told you that biochemistry is the study of the substances, the chemicals inside living organisms and how they interact, how they undergo both physical and chemical changes in a way that results in life. And what's cool to me about biochemistry, and like people who study biochemistry professionally, like people who work at OSU or people who work at a medical lab or something, they've got their own things that they're interested in. It's all really cool. But for me, what I like to think about is I like to think about things that I just can't quite fathom, that I can't quite understand. I think it's really fun. So for me, what I like to think about is the idea, for example, that if you look at a single strand of human hair, what you're going to find is that it is a bunch of smaller things hooked together, proteins. And if you look at those proteins, you're going to find that those are a bunch of smaller things hooked together. And if you look at those smaller things, what you'll find is many of the same things that we were investigating in the building molecules activity. You'll see carbon, you'll see hydrogen, you will see some other things that we saw sulfur. Sulfur was in there, so you'll see sulfur in there as well. You'll see nitrogen. And basically that's what hair is. It's carbon, hydrogen, sulfur, nitrogen, there's some oxygen in there. And essentially what happens is that there are these structures called hair follicles. We're mammals, so we have them all over the place, but those of you who haven't undergone male pattern baldness like I have, you have hair on your head, and that's kind of usually what we think about. And so these hair follicles on your head are secreting little pieces, little chunks of stuff that basically is carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, and oxygen. And those little chunks of stuff are getting attached to a long strand of hair. It kind of pushes it out just like one little chunk at a time. That's how your hair grows. And that in and of itself is crazy. And then you think about the hair follicles, which are these complex structures inside, like the head hair follicles are in your head. Those structures are in your skull, and they themselves have millions upon millions of chemicals and other things in them. They're made of a little bag, and inside the bag is a bunch of chemicals. There's DNA. All of the pieces are the same. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. There's nitrogen, there's phosphorus, there's sulfur. And then there's some other things that aren't super common, magnesium and iron, and all those things are there too. Like, it's just little pieces of stuff, but they're all hooked together and they're all mixed up. And all of this is happening without any consciousness on anyone's part, certainly not on our part. Like, you all, tonight, you're gonna go to bed, and when you wake up tomorrow morning, your hair will have grown a little bit overnight. You have millions of hair follicles, and all of those hair follicles are doing their thing, and you didn't have to lie there and make it happen. Like, can you imagine if you had to control all the chemical reactions, if you were in charge, all the billions of cells in your body, and millions of hair follicles on your body, and all the millions and billions and trillions of atoms, and all these things, and you had to keep track of it? It would never work. It all just happens. And I love that. I love that. There's an entire thought, like a area of thought and study in science called chaos theory. And basically one of the things in chaos theory is the idea that if you take randomness, if you take an utterly random collection of things, then a lot of the time you're just going to continue to have randomness. Like, if I took a bunch of marbles and I threw them on the ground in this room, they would never spontaneously organize themselves into anything. Like, you might organize them and then they just get randomized again. Like, if it weren't a person, they would never get organized. They would never get sorted by color or all put back into the same spot. But there are certain things that for purely scientific, energetic, chemical, physical reasons do spontaneously organize. One of the things that spontaneously organizes is matter itself. That's how come we're walking around the surface of a planet instead of like just being in a cloud of randomly dispersed dust. Like planets, stars, solar systems, galaxies, all these things are examples of order that has like coalesced out of what was seemingly randomness over billions of years. And the other thing that like we have kind of determined this, that it turns out that despite initial conditions of chaos, life on this planet was actually kind of likely. Like the odds that molecules would kind of come together and start doing what they do were actually reasonably high because of the way that chemicals work. And what we're going to be talking about today is one of the main reasons for that. A very, very simple chemical that has really unique properties, and those really unique properties are central to life on this planet. And we believe, at least, I mean, I'm not an expert in this kind of thing, so when I say we, I don't mean we like me and my pals. I mean, we human beings believe that if there's life somewhere else in the universe, it probably involves this chemical. There are two things that we just cannot imagine life existing without. One of those is carbon. Carbon is a really unique atom, and we're going to look at that in detail. The other is water, just water, like rain, drinking water. That turns out to be a really simple yet incredibly unique chemical. Carbon and water are almost certainly like requirements for life. A lot of people think, just for the record, a lot of people think DNA might be as well. I mean, there are people who think that if there's life outside of our solar system, outside of our galaxy, we will very likely find a molecule that's really similar to DNA. But I don't know about that. We'll just have to see. So that's part of the big picture. The other thing that I want to point out that has to do with our activity today, which is going to be to investigate properties of water, is that more so than the ecology stuff, there are going to be times over the course of the next several weeks where the work that you're doing, you might be tempted to do it without thinking about the underlying chemistry or biology. And so I'm just gonna continually invite you to think about those things. Because this is one of those things where, like, this is kind of an old school lab where you're gonna be like doing stuff like step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, do this, write down what you see, write this, you know, like put some answers down on a piece of paper. And if you're not thoughtful, you'll get it done and you won't really learn anything. And what I want you to do is I want you at every opportunity, I want you to stop, like literally stop, like stop doing stuff and just think for a second. Just think like, wow, that's crazy. And I'll give you examples of that when I'm talking today. You're gonna see examples of that today as you're working. But really what I want you to do is so the other day we worked with chemical reactions. If you think about those chemical reactions, like that's kind of amazing. And when you mixed the hydrochloric acid and the silver nitrate, do you remember what happened? Those two chemicals that you mixed together, what happened? Do you remember? When you mixed the two liquids together?
Yeah.
Yeah, what happened?
I think it made a solid.
It made a solid, something came out, right? Like you were looking at one was sort of weird looking on the outside, the silver one, but those two, when you mixed them together, like this solid stuff came out. That's crazy. Like that's insane. That's so cool to think about. And that's the kind of stuff that you're going to be seeing today with water. We're used to it because we see it so much. But if you think about it, if you think about what you see, you'll realize, wow, like it's pretty neat. And that's really the kind of where I want to encourage you to do that as much as possible. So today we're going to be talking about water. We're going to talk about a few different chemical and physical properties of water that are largely all a result of the way that water is built. 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. The way that they're hooked together leads to these really cool properties. The way that water is hooked together causes it to have a property called polarity. That polarity causes it to have a behavior that we call hydrogen bonding. Those two things together allow water to do things. It coheres, it adheres, and it exhibits surface tension. And so we're going to look at all those things, and then we're going to think specifically about the context of the importance of water to living organisms, because all of those things are properties of water in living or non-living systems. All right, so it starts with this idea that water is something that we call polar. Polar, you know polar from thinking about the Earth. The Earth has the North Pole and the South Pole, two different sides. Water kind of has the same thing. It's not geographic. There's no North Pole and there's no South Pole to water. But there are magnetic poles. And with water, the way that they're shaped ends up leaving one part of the molecule having a little bit more of what we call a negative charge, and one part of the molecule having what we call a positive charge. It's like a magnet. It's not exactly like a magnet, but water molecules are kind of like tiny, weird-shaped magnets. Electrical charge and magnetism are related, but they're not the same thing. But at the level at which we're really thinking about it, we can think about it as if it was the same way. It's kind of like the part of the oxygen, or part of the water molecule is like the north part of a magnet, and part of a water molecule is like the south part of a magnet. Not really, but it's really close to that. And instead of being north and south like magnets are, because it's charge, not magnetism, we call them positive and negative charges. So one side of the oxygen molecule, or of the water molecule, has a slight positive charge, and the other has a slight negative charge. And if you look at a water molecule close up, which we can't do with like our eyes or even like light microscopes, but what you'll see is some of you probably remember that water, when you were doing the building molecules activity, would have the chemical formula H2O. That means there were 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. And the way they're hooked together is like this. It's kind of bent. The oxygen atom is on one side, and both the hydrogen atoms are kind of closer to each other, right? So they sort of like, it's like angled. And that's what we're seeing in these diagrams here. The red circle is oxygen, the white circles are hydrogen. Chemical bonds are formed when even smaller particles called electrons are kind of shared between atoms. And what happens when you get an oxygen and 2 hydrogens like this is that the oxygen is a little bit of an electron hog, okay? So it would be kind of like if one of you had a piece of pizza and I wanted a piece of pizza too. I'm bigger and stronger than you. So I would grab onto the piece of pizza and I would pull it, and because I'm bigger and stronger, it would be a little bit closer to me than it was to you. But we would both still have the pizza. It's just that I would sort of have it more. And that's what goes on with oxygen and hydrogen. The oxygen kind of shares electrons, but it's a hog. So it ends up with a little bit more of them. And electrons have a negative charge. So you end up with this bent molecule with a slight negative charge on one side, a slight positive charge on the other side. And those ends stick to each other, just like a magnet. So like magnets, the opposite charges will attract each other, and the like charges will repel each other. So this water molecule right here and this water molecule right here are pushing on each other, because it's like 2 magnets next to each other that are kind of the same end. And you've all done this before, I'm sure, and if you haven't, I have some magnets that you could use to try it with. When you take these magnets, and if you try to put them together one way, they'll stick. And if you try to put them together the other way, you can't get them to stick. I'm pushing and I can't get this to stick no matter what I do. It's pushing back on me. And so that's what happens with water molecules as well. The oxygen end of one water molecule will kind of stick to the hydrogen end of the other water molecule, just like magnets. And just like magnets, it's not an unbreakable bond, right? Like if you had a bowl full of magnets, you could reach in and pull out a magnet. If you did that, you might pull out another one, you just break it off, and you end up with one magnet. That's the same way that water molecules work. When they line up with each other and sort of stick together like magnets, we have a special name for it, and that name is hydrogen bond. So water molecules make these sticky connections that we call hydrogen bonds. Since they're like magnets, they can stick together a bit if they get close enough. And the force that holds them together is what we call a hydrogen bond. So this is a slightly different picture of a water molecule, but it's the same idea. We have one oxygen atom, two hydrogens. The oxygen atom has a slightly negative charge. The hydrogen atoms have a slightly positive charge. And then over here we can see that this water molecule has a hydrogen here with a little bit of a positive charge that's kind of pulling on this water molecule's oxygen atom that has a little bit of a negative charge. They're kind of stuck together a little bit. And this water molecule's oxygen is pulling a little bit on this water molecule's hydrogen. They're pulling on each other. There's repulsion too. This hydrogen atom and this hydrogen atom are pushing themselves apart, pushing each other apart. You can see they don't come too close because no matter what you do, if you've got a whole bunch of water molecules, there's always going to be some that are pushing and some that are pulling on each other. And they kind of arrange themselves in such a way that they're pulling closer and pushing farther away until they're just sort of comfortable, like they're being a little bit pushed and a little bit pulled, and they end up in just sort of a spot. And those connections make it just a little bit difficult to separate water molecules from each other. They stick to each other. It's like that simple. They just sort of stick to each other a little bit. That attractive force is called a hydrogen bond. You need to know that it's called a hydrogen bond because we're going to refer to it as a hydrogen bond. You'll read about it. The reason it's called a hydrogen bond is because one of the atoms is a hydrogen atom, but they probably could have just as easily called it an oxygen bond, right? Like, it's sort of weird that they call that a hydrogen bond. Really what it is a connection between a hydrogen and an oxygen atom in certain molecules, like water. So that seems like, okay, why is that such a big deal? But it turns out that there are a number of things about that make it a huge deal. Probably the thing that makes it the biggest deal is with chemicals. When you take water and you mix it with chemicals, because of its shape and its polarity, it can dissolve a lot of chemicals. That's why organisms, humans included, have so much water in them. It's not because we need the water for anything, it's not we use the water that much. It's more that we need that water to hold everything else, right? If the water weren't there, then all the chemicals in our cells would just be these like dry things that like couldn't interact with each other. Water dissolves everything, makes everything flow around. That's probably the most important thing about water. We're going to look at the physical stuff today. We're going to look at physical properties of water that result from these hydrogen bonds. And those are really important for living organisms too. And then we'll look at the chemical property of water next week, toward the end of next week. And there's a bunch of stuff that we could look at, but we'll probably call a halt to it at the end of next week. Okay, so I mentioned that polarity is the property of water that water molecules have. One side that's a little bit positive and one side that's a little negative. Hydrogen bonds happen because of polarity. those hydrogen bonds result in 3 observable properties of water. One is called cohesion, one is called adhesion, and one is called surface tension. Those all result from the fact that water molecules tend to stick together somewhat. And water molecules can also stick to other things. Water is sticky. And that seems weird because it's like, well, no, it's not, but it is, and we'll see lots of examples of it today. Oh, no, you're good. So you don't have to write anything down here. We're going to talk about these things separately. So we'll talk about cohesion, adhesion, and surface tension. Cohesion and adhesion are, you just have to remember, and because you don't have to memorize anything in this class, you can always look it up. The difference between cohesion and adhesion has to do with the fact that cohesion is when water sticks to other water. Adhesion is when water sticks to something else. And then surface tension describes a supportive force that water can have. All right? So let's look at all of these. Let's start with cohesion. Cohesion is the tendency of water molecules to stick together. And the easiest way for us to see that is with water drops. When you take water and you if you take some water and you put it near some other water, it'll make a drop. And you can add water to the pile, so to speak, and you'll get more and more and more and more water, and then eventually it kind of overflows and spreads out, but it still sort of collects in drops. It doesn't just sort of spread out evenly. Now, there are some conditions in which it does, and you've all seen conditions like that. You've seen water spread out over something evenly and it's not in drops, but it's also very common for water to show up as drops on things. And that's called cohesion. There's other interesting things that happen because of cohesion. If water is sticking together and it can form drops, you also see things like this. If you get one drop that kind of goes down a windshield like this, it sort of stretches out like this because all those water droplets are sticking to each other. It's like an elastic band almost. If they're all sort of spreading out and they stick to each other. Water molecules can actually pull each other around. You can actually tow one water molecule with another one. And you'll see a little bit of this today. The most important thing for this biologically has to do with plants, actually, and how plants can get water from the soil into their roots, up their stem, and up to the leaves. And they can do that through something called capillary action, which is basically water pulling. It's complicated. It's not just water pulling on itself, but without water's ability to pull on itself, we wouldn't have plants that grew out of the ground like this. Okay? So cohesion is the property of water that causes it to stick to other water molecules. The most obvious, visible effect of that is these water droplets. Okay? And then the next property is called adhesion. And adhesion happens when water molecules stick to something else. And water doesn't stick to everything. Some things it does, and some things it doesn't. I don't know who did it, it wasn't me.
Do you smell it too?
No, I don't. I just saw your reaction. What? So it was probably you. No, I'm not saying anything, and certainly this isn't going on the video. It's going on the video. But this is biology. We can talk about this kind of stuff. All right, so with adhesion, we get water that sticks to other things. And adhesion is super fun to demonstrate. We can see it in a whole bunch of ways. If I take this just piece of paper towel, I can put some water on it, and that water will adhere to the paper towel. All that water that I put on there is basically still on the paper towel. And some of it's coming out, you can see some of it dripping, but a lot of it is sticking to the paper towel. And it's just like stuck to it. Now, there are some things that water won't stick to, at least not very well. And but a paper towel is really sticky to water. It's not sticky to us, but the water sticks to it. That's because paper towels are a little bit polar too. They have some positive and negative parts to them. Water molecules have positive and negative parts, so they stick there like magnets. This is why, if you look at the windows right now, you can see water droplets on the windows. They're just hanging there. Why are they hanging there? Why don't they keep falling? Because they're stuck to the window. Glass is a little bit polar. And that's part of the reason why we see this capillary action. Part of it is water molecules sticking to each other. Part of it is that water sticks to certain substances like glass. And these are little glass tubes, and these little glass tubes have various widths, and what you can see is the more narrow ones, they kind of suck the water up. It just goes up on its own, like nothing. There isn't anybody pushing. There's no like pressure. It just goes up, and the reason is because the water sticks to the side of the container and kind of climbs, and other water sticks to it, and it gets pulled up with it. So all this stickiness causes water to rise up in thin tubes, and that's something that we call capillary action, and it's super important. Capillary action it plays out on a large scale in plants, but in lots of other areas as well. So when we think about like living organisms, we often think about organisms like animals that can move. When we think about our actual capillaries, there is some pressure there because our heartbeat forces blood through our arteries and goes all the way out to our capillaries. But capillaries are thin enough that they could exhibit capillary action as well, and that's where the name comes from. Okay. So cohesion is water sticking together. Adhesion is water sticking to other things. Most of the time we kind of see them in concert, right? They work together. This is cohesion, making a water droplet. Adhesion, causing that water droplet to stick to a leaf. This is cohesion, the water sticking to itself in a column, and adhesion, the water sticking to the side of the glass tube. So most of the time we see both of those things together. Surface tension is a little bit different. Surface tension happens when there's a boundary between water and something that isn't polar, like air. And if water comes into contact with something that isn't polar, like air, then cohesion kind of pulls those water molecules together, and that creates an upward force. That upward force is created the same way that you would get upward force on like a trampoline. If you think about a trampoline, there's nothing pushing straight up from the bottom, right? But if you have a trampoline, if you put something on it, what'll happen is it kind of bends down in the middle a little bit. Like you can see this tape dispenser on this drum head is bent down just a little bit. That bending down creates an upward force. That's how surface tension works. Now with water, it's not like super large. Like if you go walking into a lake, you're not gonna notice the water, like put the surface of the water pushing up on you. But if you jump into a lake and you land belly first, you better believe you'll notice that upward force, right? If you've ever done a belly flop, have you ever done a belly flop? Like from like you're high up and you come down and you get out and your belly is just a beet red from the impact. That is surface tension. That is the pressure of the water pushing up on you right as you hit the surface. So it can generate a lot of force under the right circumstances. So that surface tension is caused by the cohesion of water molecules as they, in a condition when they're forming a boundary with something that isn't polar. So air or even oil. Like if we have a mixture of water and oil, then the boundary between those two substances, there will be surface tension in the water. And that can support things like water, things can rest on top of water. It's a little bit different from floating. If you think about floating, what we're talking about is something that is partially in the water, right? So if you have like a boat, this is the worst drawing I've ever made. This is the worst drawing anybody's ever made. But if you have a boat that's floating in the water, it's not being supported by surface tension. But if you have a leaf that's floating on top of the water, it is supported by surface tension. It's a little bit hard to tell the difference. But it's also super interesting to look at. And there are some things that we're not sure to what degree they're floating and to what degree they're experiencing surface tension. It's sometimes a little bit hard to tell. When it comes to living organisms, all of these things are important. And you don't have to write this down because we're going to talk about most of these things in detail down the road. But mostly what I want you to do is just think about as you are working today and as you work over the next couple of weeks. I mentioned that, that one of the things that's really important has to do with chemicals. And we'll get into this more, but water can dissolve stuff. So that is super important. And then when we think about adhesion and cohesion, it's sort of the capillary action thing, we can get water from plant roots all the way up into their leaves and potentially think about redwood trees, like the tallest trees known to humankind. They get water all the way from the soil, all the way to their highest needles at the top of the tree. So that's adhesion and cohesion. And then, you know what these are, right?
Lily pads.
Yeah, they're lily pads. Those float, a lot of animals float on the surface of water using surface tension. Did I tell you about my water strider study? Yeah, because I didn't know, and I think somebody probably did, but this was like way before the internet. But when I was in college, I wanted to know, do water striders float because of surface tension, or do they float because they're less dense than water? And so I did a study to try to figure it out. And I was like measuring the size and weight of water striders to try to figure it out. It was really pretty fun. And what I found out was that it was surface tension. And you all can see that. When you look at a water strider that's on the surface of the water, you can see that it's surface tension because you can see the little dimple in the water that's formed by the legs. And you can see the reflection. If you go out, not today obviously because the creek's kind of crazy, but if you go out to the creek on a summer day when the water is clear and shallow and there's a lot of sunlight, you can see the reflected shadow of these little dimples in the water. So a water strider shadow has these 4 little round spots where its legs are pushing the water and making a lens. So it's pretty neat. All right, so what we're going to do for the rest of the class period today is we're going to play around with all of this stuff. So I'm going to shut off the video